We are now going to end the panel discussion, and first I would like to introduce Kathleen Akrulik, who will be moderating the panel discussion. Kathleen Akrulik is a philosopher of science. She is also, this is really important for us, the founding director for the Center for Women's Studies and Feminist Research. And that was back from 1987 to 1989. She was also the chair of philosophy from 1992 to 1997. And she was the Dean of Arts and Humanities from 1999 to 2008. And that was really important for women's studies because that was the time when we were growing and becoming a department, and it was great to have Kathleen Akrulik as Dean at that time. So I'm going to hand over the panel to Kathleen.
Thanks, Helen. Welcome back. Before we get going, I just wanted to point out that the beautiful white roses are from Constance Backhouse. She sent them to the house for a different feminist event, but bringing them here was one way of making her physically present. And I told her this morning we were going to do that, and she was very pleased. So, for Constance. We thought that we would begin the panel by letting each of the four panelists speak for up to 15 minutes in the order in which they spoke originally, but not formally, just to notice connections, tensions, unresolved issues, to raise some questions that haven't been raised yet or perhaps should have been raised. So it will be informal. If anybody goes more than 15 minutes, we'll stop. So, Carla.
So let me start again by saying thank you. Oftentimes we look at a day-long event, I think, oh, it's going to be so exhausting. And it just kept getting more interesting and more interesting and more engaged, and the questions and the discussion were so, were also just so engaging that I'm actually both tired and jazzed at the same time. There were a lot of themes that I saw running through the talks, and I learned a lot today. I can see myself how I would write and think differently, having heard the other speakers and having heard the questions. One theme that I want to focus on that came up across the board was the notion of responsibility and relationship individually when we're creating knowledge and when we are looking at the structure of our knowledge-producing institutions. I'm a philosopher of science too, and so I think knowledge-producing institutions, we might think our departments, our law schools, or what have you. And so this is something that I was starting to think about when I was thinking about who is science by and who is science for, and how are those two things related. How can I be confident that our scientific institutions are producing knowledge that can help me if a person like me in important ways is excluded from those institutions? And thinking about that in terms of attending to the heterogeneity of the publics and the different people that science both includes and is supposed to serve. And then I heard Frances talk about the way that the self-image of the university stops us from being able to do this in a responsible way when it comes to issues of race. So when she was talking about the Canadian pride and multiculturalism, plus, and I'm of course paraphrasing here, and so this is what I learned from her. It might not be exactly what she intended me to learn from her. But the notion of multiculturalism being a Canadian value, almost like an iconic Canadian value, and universities as being progressive and left-wing places, so therefore there is no racism there. And what that is a move that creates ignorance about racism, and what it would happen. The function there is to make whites, or a function there is to make whites really a lot more comfortable in our institutions, because the racism that exists is invisible to white people, or at least to many white people. And so the notion of thinking specifically of as our universities or institutions as being situated as Eurocentric in white spaces is something that pushed me a lot. And then I listened to Joanne talk about the importance of service to diverse communities, and I thought, well, why didn't I say it that way? That sounded perfect. And the notion there that the presence of difference within our communities, within our law schools, is something that allows us to be of service to more people, and a better service to a wide range of people. Both in the case of being able to serve by teaching, being able to serve in terms of being a space where, so for example, for me in philosophy, if women students can see a woman philosophy professor, that has an impact on their ability, on issues of imposter syndrome and ability to think about what they might do in their career. But also in terms, and here I'm thinking of some article that Lawrence Blum wrote a long time ago when he was asked the question, what good does he do as a black professor? And he said one of the good things that he does for a black professor is not just being role models for black students, but being role models of a black intellectual for white students and how that impacts the way that the things that we implicitly teach through our silence and through absence in our institutions, and trying to address that as an issue. And then I was listening to Scott talk and about the notion, not specifically, the words weren't Eurocentric in white spaces, but of a settler academy and a colonial institution, in a way that for me as a Canadian who went to the States and came home, and I had created when I was away a vision of home. And it was a very whitewashed and realizing vision of what home was. And so coming back and hearing that and being back part of these institutions creates a dissonance, and it's something that is useful and difficult to work through, especially when we do specifically scholarship on diversity and inclusion in the structures of our institutions. And what I heard Scott saying so usefully was the notion that what do we do? What we need to do is be responsible for our relationships, and you can tell me if, responsible for relationships, and also responsible for relationships to the peoples whose place is where we are in some sense. And the notion that, and so when I think about that, I think about the academy as being a place where we need to pay attention to being people and scholars and teachers who earn trust and earn credibility and are accountable to each other and to a wide range of peoples. And so then I wanted to take all of that I learned and think about two questions that were asked, and I can't remember exactly who asked them, I'm sorry, it's been a long day. And one of them was, I was thinking back to my talk, and like, why do I talk about the benefits of science and diversity as epistemic benefits, as selfish benefits, as opposed to ethical benefits? And I don't want those ethical benefits to go away. And so one of the ways that I think about this, and Nancy Tuana is a philosopher who's helped me think about these things really in a rich way, where she talks about our ethics and our epistemology as being intertwined. And one of the things that feminism has brought to philosophy in that way is to realize that we are responsible for our choices in our ways of knowing. And so, which speaks, I think, to some of the things that you were talking about. And even when I look back to the first article that I put up of that article of Lorraine Coates is the subject epistemically significant. One of the moves that got made early in feminist epistemology, and this was largely at this time by white epistemologists, but philosophers of color, feminist philosophers of color, very small group, but started talking about these kinds of issues very closely, close after that. And so Lorraine Coates' notion that an epistemology shouldn't just be a notion of what is the knowledge-producing relationship between a subject separate from the object that we know, and we shouldn't use examples like, oh, I know this bottle has got delicious water in it as being my fundamental epistemological examples, but looking at knowing other people as being our fundamental epistemological examples, and in that case, knowing across difference becomes something that's really challenging and really important. And how would philosophy look differently if that was the question that moved us from the beginning? And so from that perspective, when I think about this notion of ethics and epistemology being intertwined in terms of responsible relationships in a rich kind of context, in that situation, what I was trying to get at, and I can understand better now, is that when we think about when we think about the epistemic benefits of science, that I believe strongly that there is a moral imperative for us to do science well, right? And that moral imperative plays itself out in a lot of different ways. But in some ways, it's very simple that our scientific knowledge matters. When we look at some of the challenges that we're faced, whether they're medical challenges or environmental challenges, these are resources that are important resources. And so we have that kind of prediction, but also then we can think this will be the last move I make, one more step about thinking carefully about, so doing it well, what does that mean, right? And so the question there is, I think, doing science well for a wide range of peoples. And so in that situation, we can say, so if I use me as, I like to talk about me, if I use me as my example, and the injustice of me being excluded from a knowledge-producing community on the basis of gender is something, we can think of that as being something that's a moral harm against me. But we can also think of that as being a moral harm against people who share that subject position with me. And so we can think about that in terms of gender or race or in a lot of different ways. And so one of the reasons why I'm very interested in thinking about the importance of science by the people and science for the people is that one of the things that I think can justify our confidence that our science, that doing science well means doing science that can meet my interests or interested about people like me in a relevant way, is that people like me can participate in a relevant way. And so I think the excellence of science in that sense is yet another, sort of the epistemic excellence of science we've got a moral imperative to push towards. And that's something that I couldn't think through clearly until I listened to what everybody had to say today. And that's where I'll stop.
Thank you, Carla. Before we move on to Joanne, I want to thank you one more time for showing up on remarkably short notice and giving a barnbuster of a talk. We'll be interested in what you have to say now.
Certainly, as I said before, it truly has been and is my pleasure to be here. What I think I can talk about are just a couple of ideas, partially flowing from some things I didn't get to say, but a lot of it from the exchanges that I was having in between, and as well as listening to my colleagues. And one of the pieces I didn't get to articulate was about my own choices and how I came to be in this space. And one of the things that I think that has been underlying my conversations, particularly with those of you who are still in that transition space, as students, I talked to some people who are undergraduate in other programs, and I talked to some people who are doctoral programs and postdocs, some people trying to transition into the academy. And I want to throw out a word which I think probably applies to some of what you're describing, which is epistemic violence, which some of you have heard Gayatri Spivak's term. And by that I mean that there is a way in which the structure of knowing is violating you. That's how I would frame it, just very directly in that way. It's not simply about a negotiation. In other words, if we moved it away from talking about systems of knowing and we were actually talking about sexual violence, we would not say there's a space between the person who's just clopped me on the head, on the side of the head, and let's maybe discuss what I mean by being clopped on the side of the head. We'd say that's an assault, it was unconsented, this is the lawyer in me talking, we'd say we don't have a debate about what we're going to talk about. Somehow, because we've entered into the space of the academy and because there's this aura culturally of gentility and conversation, which really often means sometimes words flowing only one way because they can't hear you and they refuse to listen. It's not a dialogue, it's not a dialectic, it's simply somebody talking at you repeatedly and refusing to hear anything you have to say. We're not applying that notion of violence in quite the same way. So I'm a person who's had always a love-hate relationship with notions of chilly climate in the classroom. And this is with all due respect and with real, and when I say due respect, I mean due respect, really appreciated the work of Constance Backhouse and others talking about that in the classroom. My personal feeling was that I entered the classroom expecting that I was going to be violated. So that was the difference. I didn't wake up to a surprise, oh my gosh, this is happening to me. By the time I'd gotten to the point of teaching in university, I'd had it happen so many different ways that I actually would have been surprised if I got a group hug because I was standing in the space. So I didn't have this view that the space was going to become safe or starting space safe, and I think that flows from my subjectivity as a black woman living in this society, for me, that my awareness of it created that understanding. But I did want to make clear that for all of the outspokenness and the pieces around it, I do think that the more vulnerable your position, the more you have to forgive yourself when you don't join in direct battle each and every time something faces you. I do think that there are accountabilities, even as you face your battle, and I've had this discussion with some of my colleagues where they'll say, we, speaking about themselves and women or racialized students at the same time. I said, no, we're not in the same subject positions. We're employed. Many of us are tenured, and even if you have a desire for promotion, exactly why should the student become the cannon fodder to your aspiration? We are not a collectivity at that time. And at that point, I think we do have a responsibility, regardless of the broader responsibility of the institutional challenge, we have a responsibility because we're in a higher position of power to be more protective of our students, not because of a maternalistic, paternalistic position, but because we have to acknowledge our relative subject positions inside the battle, as well as the broader construction of the battle. So I wanted to get that across. The other piece that has informed me is that part of my understandings of violence have to do, and I was speaking a bit about this to one of your colleagues, about my own way of managing and negotiating personal violence in my life. And my experience, often I notice the metaphors tend to come out of all women together, many of us have experienced sexual violence. My experience is not flowing from that, though that's a separate experience in another part of my life. It is, picture me, 9½. I'm in Montreal. My father is from the Caribbean, as I've described, he's from Trinidad. My father was, in many, many ways, a very unusual man. My father spoke 7 languages, okay? My father had English, French, Spanish, spoke classical Greek, which people rarely heard spoken, but I did, Latin, and taught himself Italian and German because he had an aversion to having the librettos, because he did not know if he could trust the translation, and he wanted to be sure. So this is, you want to understand where I come from with this stuff? Honestly, this is where I come from. When I was a kid, I grew up with my grandparents. From 15 months till I was 5, I lived in Trinidad with my grandparents. So I have an almost immigrant experience, because at 5½, I distinctly remember what it was like to come to Canada, even though I'm Canadian born in Montreal. Now, when I started school, my father told me something. He said, one day something is going to happen to you. And the only way that you will be able to save yourself is your ability to open your mouth and get to me. And that, you know, imagine I'm 6. I said to my dad, what is this thing? He doesn't tell me. Every so often he's reminding me about this, and he'd say, Joanne, you know what we're like? This is power, he said, because it means you can speak back to any person, any white person, any adult, because you will need to get to me. But remember what I said, you abuse this power, and you just use it on the hop, you don't know how mad I'm going to be. So I had this balance between, I don't get to just sound off, but I have to use it. Fast forward, I'm around 9½. I'm in a schoolyard. I still don't know the exact number. A group of children in high school came from another high school into my school. And they chased me through the schoolyard to the farthest corner, and they beat me up. It's my first concrete recollection of the N-word, use of the term. And I was beaten. They take me to the principal's office, and they're oh so distressed. They tell me that this is trying to patch me up to send me back to class, that I have to go back to class. I can tell you, I understood this was what my father was talking about. Now, my father had explained many things to me, and you could see my nascent legal training coming to the fore. Part of the reason my memory is so crystal, to be honest with you, is because of the extent to which my father repeated my story, because he felt it was one of the most important things I'd ever done. So at 9½, somebody was asking me, have I always been like this? I will argue with you, yes, I was. At 9½, I looked at this group of adults, and I said, I don't want to stay here, I need my father. And they said, your father sent you to us. We are your teachers, we're taking care of you, like you're in school. And I said, no, that's not what he said. I need my father, I need him right now. Apparently what my father heard later was, I looked at these people and I said, you know, when somebody keeps you where you don't want to be, you're kidnapped. I said, and I apparently looked at them all and said, well, am I kidnapped? Because I wasn't sure. This led to the call to my father. My father, some days later, was speaking to me. He said, what's wrong with you? What you have to understand is, child, I don't have children, but those of you who have children, you know how children's worlds can be very, very concrete. Mine was. I could have vibrated into the separate atoms of my being. I was so angry at what had happened to me. I wasn't frightened, I was enraged. Like, to me, my entire universe had been destroyed. Like, whatever I thought it was no longer the same way. So my dad says to me, so, what's wrong with you? I looked at him and I said, I'm mad. Why are you mad? Who are you mad at? White people. That's what I said. I said, oh. He said next, do you love me? I said, yes, I do. He said, do you love mommy? I said, yes, I do. He said, no, you don't. He said, every day you build an altar in the center of yourself and you worship these people with your hate. You need to go to your room. You're not too young to learn. Go to your room. Now, the first time I gave that example, I was using it when I decided to use it as a form of teaching. I was actually training teachers. And immediately one of the teachers in the room put up her hand and said, your father sounds like a very cruel man. In fact, given that you were about 9 years old, he punished you. I said, how interesting culture is. I said, we don't have a culture of timeouts. Do you think I thought I was in a timeout? I said, my family, as in my brother and sister were just born at that time, like there's 7 and 8 years between my brother and sister. I said, my favorite place in the world was to go to my room. I said, what do you think I did? I went up to my room, I played with my Barbies, and my parents had made sure I had a black Barbie, by the way. And I played with my Barbies, I read my books. I'm quite happy up there. But what happened is when I opened the door to leave my room, the only thing that I recollected from what my father said was that something I was doing made him think I did not love him. I didn't care about the people that hurt me. I cared that I somehow was hurting my parents. And so I decided I had to behave differently. Whatever it was I was doing was hurting my parents. That was my first lesson in seeing things very, very, very differently. But what my parents did not do was rob me of my sense of my capacity to choose, even though much of the current thinking would say, you're a victim, let's talk about your pain. My father believed, even at 9 and a half, I could master my own pain. I did not need to have a navel-gazing session with him. I was his child, and he trusted me to figure it out. Would he have helped me afterwards? I'm absolutely certain he would have. But he gave me the opportunity to begin building the infrastructure inside of myself, to decide I was sufficient to anything, even to a moment where I was physically overwhelmed and physically hurt, that I could transcend that simply by reorganizing its meaning. That is how I've approached my entire career when faced with obstacles. My entire career. It doesn't mean that I don't experience pain and violence. It does mean that I can pause for breath and reconfigure it. As I said during the break to someone else, I refuse to accept someone's standards that mean that when I apply them, I am to come to the conclusion that I am insufficient to what is in front of me or I am lacking. I will not do that. It means there's a problem with the standard. There is nothing wrong with me. That's the best advice I can give you. That is the part that I have always resisted when I come across certain aspects of critical scholarship. I'm unable, almost intuitively, to accept the aspects of the scholarship and its application that make me feel less powerful than I believe I am. You could say it's a force of imagination and delusion. I choose to say absolutely not. In the spaces that I've lived, and I've made some of the choices, all the things you've described here, and the methods of it, I've done all those parts. I have been within institutions creating programs, I've been outside analyzing programs, I've consulted with people, I've used the law, I've done all those things, and I don't judge them as better or worse. They are contextual to what I needed to do at the time, or what somebody needed from me in terms of my skill. The issue is having an arsenal of multiple choices and not having to rise or fall on simply one strategy. So I am not saying that we can walk around and say violence doesn't exist in a variety of forms. What I am saying is what you give over to the violator is a matter to some extent, because I do not want to disrespect the extent to which violence can deform, transform, and completely oppress an individual. But I'm saying there are moments and some times where you will be able to transform its meaning. You must be able to do that, otherwise you are not able to engage in the forms of activism you wish to do. You cannot use yourself roiling around in your own dismay to be unable to hear whether it's your client, your student, or whatever. I cannot project my own pain back onto them, because I am not supposed to lead them back through my own life journey. They are asking me to help them. And that requires me to constrain myself. Not to misunderstand myself, but to mine my own experience for the pieces that allow me to recognize myself in them, but to speak to that self from the site of insight and experience that I now possess, not to place them in a situation of having to repeat my journey. So, you know, that would be my main point. And the final other point, and there wasn't a space really to talk about this, and I'm just throwing it up here with a feeling of dissatisfaction in some ways, because I had it in my materials and I just didn't have enough space, is that the one ground that I didn't talk about, and there was a specific aspect of it I wanted to talk about, was issues of disability. And part of why I wanted to talk about it is because our conversations about access are riddled with conversations around accommodation. In some ways, I think it is that area that is suffering a very specific kind of deformity, because at best, even though we have a lot of bureaucratic infrastructure around it, the fundamental radical lessons of disability we have not embraced. And I want to give you, I'm going to try and explain what I mean. So we talk about the ways, we talk about barrier removal, we talk about all of those pieces. But certainly some forms of disability speak to a fundamental critique of the capitalist employment model. What is the magic of full-time employment? Why would that be the norm? Why do we think people need to work 40 hours a week? Why do we not have full employment? Is it because we have some people, I would argue, who are overworking? Right? There are people who are in highly privileged positions and otherwise who overwork. We have people who are overpaid. Right? They are absorbing the income, the dollars that could go to make a living, dignified wage to other people. The notion of, you know, freedom of contract and all of that operates in that way. The person with a disability who says, I need the dignity of work, but in no way, shape, and form by whatever you do am I ever going to work 40 hours a week. We have no notion about whether somebody is entitled to be in a workplace and simply accomplish the goal of what needs to be done. Why should I care whether you're there 9 to 5? Shouldn't I care whether you finish the task in front of you within the reasonable time that's required for the production of that task? How curious. We also are very, very impatient. And even in the progressive circles, I would say where we see it in the other area of disability which challenges it, I would argue are psychiatric disabilities, particularly persons who are bipolar and schizophrenic. So we are very comfortable to have them there if they're medicalized. If they're on their meds, we get along just fine. Where we have the difficulty is when they're in their manic phases or in a different phase. Right? Because all of a sudden they are actually challenging every aspect of the norm of what it means to be professional, what it means to be responsible, what it means to evaluate professional performance. So I just wanted to sort of, you know, there are two kind of disjunctive pieces, but two pieces that I didn't get a chance to fully express, but I just wanted to put out there that in every way, what true participation from persons who are supposedly excluded means to me is a complete disruption of our understanding of the norm and a complete disruption and reconfiguration of how we ought to do the work we do and how we organize ourselves as society. That's the fundamental radical project, not simply the protest outside the door with the picket signs. The fundamental project is that redistribution of income. The fundamental project is the actual true access to dignity for each and every single person. And that requires discomfort, displacement, and a replacement of income, money, and organization. So, you know, and obviously I'm coming from a space of incredible privilege in that hat as a law professor and a person of a middle class and all of those things, regardless of my history. I can't use my history in this context as an excuse to name those things, but at least I'm willing to say to you, it's a question and a preoccupation that hopefully I move from it being just rhetorical to increasingly trying to address that part as much as I address the issues of how to bring critical pedagogy into my classroom. I think the latter part I've talked about is every bit as much important and probably a piece that I still have a tremendous amount of development to do but it is also part of the larger project I think I'm engaged in doing in my work.
Thank you. Scott.
Great. I'm so inspired by my colleagues. I don't know if I have my own train of thought anymore. I'm so deeply involved in thinking what you. Thank you for what you're sharing. Of course, because I went last the whole day, I was thinking about my paper. I will confess that. And so hopefully this is useful. That some of the things I will say were notes that I was taking with regards to how the various presentations seemed to me to engage with things that I also wanted to bring forth when I spoke, so hopefully that'll be useful to the discussion. I loved every presentation, and I loved your presentation this morning. Carla, it was very inspiring for me and taught me some interesting things about epistemology, which is a field that I haven't really engaged as closely. I'm realizing I should engage it even more closely than I have since being an undergraduate, actually, as far as like reading the really core texts, but then specifically going into feminist epistemology as a scholar and a teacher. But I'm seeing that there's a broader conversation going on among epistemologists, not just through feminist epistemology, that would be instructive for me. And you brought forth early in your presentation, I believe you were referring to Helen Longino's work, talking about how better work, better knowledge is produced when bringing different perspectives to the problem simultaneously. And it kind of resonates for me a little bit with how you also, as part of your conclusion, emphasized, if I wrote it down correctly, what if knowing across differences was actually the premise of epistemology? I'm very inspired by this way of thinking. I thought at the time, earlier today, that this really takes down the lone knower as a model for knowledge. And when I think about the lone knower, I certainly think about the Archimedean perspective, and I think about how Western thought actually directly inherits all through, over a couple thousand years, some very basic premises within certain forms of Greek and ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, but then transforms them over time. So that by the late Middle Ages or the early modern period, which is also the period of the inception of settler colonization, the lone knower becomes the model of one who proclaims. And here I want to think about the papal proclamation of 1537 that decreed that indigenous peoples were human after the debate between Sepulveda and de las Casas about whether indigenous people should be treated either as barbarians under Aristotelian law or whether they should be treated as actually fully human beings. The only premise on that side, which was the one that won, but you see how it's actually a genocidal conclusion, because by being designated as human beings, they could be forcibly converted to Christianity and forcibly incorporated into what we call ontological genocide, the wholesale project of the Spanish to completely replace indigenous modes of governance and ways of knowing with a model that not only was supposed to teach people how to think differently, but also put them in a permanently racialized subject relocation to the colonizing caste. And everything from just, so, and Patricia Seed's book is so crucial here. Ceremonies of Possession and European Conquest of the New World. I can't recommend it highly enough as something to go back to years and years later. And I think of the Spanish Requerimiento, which was that document that the conquistadors would actually, it had been sort of standardized after a few tries that were all mixed up, and then they decided to standardize this document. And it basically demanded that, it was of course read in medieval Spanish, so great for all of the indigenous peoples who are lined up opposing the Spanish with their guns and allied armies who are about to accomplish the form of conquest. And it demands that everyone listening to it agree to the superiority of the Spanish sovereign and of Jesus Christ. And that if they agree to acknowledge that superiority, then they will be forcibly converted, they will not be enslaved, and their women and children will not be raped and murdered. But then they say, if you disagree, then we're going to do all those things. And so, of course, that's what happened. And this kind of, but this is, I'm seeing there's something going on where the Pope speaks, the conquistador speaks. There's this proclamation. It's a body, it's a white, it's a Europe, it's not directly in a modern sense racialized yet, but there's a European civilizational male patriarchal body that is announcing singularly that a new truth exists. And what will result is mass genocide. One speaks and everyone will suffer, and you'll suffer, indigenous people will suffer either way, death or assimilation. So that's the logic. Now, and why do we call, and you could even take it all the way back, sorry, I'm just fascinated by this, I should go on to another topic, but you could even take it to, you know, Amerigo Vespucci never came here. Right? And so his map of the hemisphere was also phantasmagorical. It had like sea serpents, and I mean, and so how did one person, that lone knower, become the name of an entire half of a planet? And that's a form of ontological violence, epistemic violence, but I call it ontological violence, or it's actually colonialism as the replacement of an ontology with another ontology, right? So I'm thinking there's a lot of really interesting connections here with epistemology and thinking, and that if you were to go into these questions, understanding that the lone knower is a colonizing knower. Now, I don't know how to make that as a universal claim, but I can tell you that for over 500 years on this land, the lone knower is a colonial knower, and the colonial knower is a heteropatriarchal knower, and the heteropatriarchal knower is a colonizing. I mean, you just go, you trace the connections and you realize that it's not actually, at some point, it's not only that it is possible to talk about how these things are connected, but at some point it's actually not possible maybe to talk about the kind of epistemology you want to take down without talking about all of these things. And so that, I hope that's a helpful like inspiration, because now I want to read epistemology, and so we need to stay in touch. I also, to move on to Francis Henry's work, I was deeply moved by the whole project. I'm going to teach that collection in my classes as soon as I can. The chapter which I skimmed from her copy, which she narrates the variety of interviews from Indigenous interviewees, is extremely powerful and very difficult to take in all at once. There's so much struggle, so much experience of violence, and so much of a demand for change there. But I'm excited about working with it as a model for how I will return to the work of transforming the academy. Again, I wanted to bring back that idea of ontology, because she talks about how, and again, what I'm doing when I say ontology, I'm actually thinking about phenomena. So what I'm trying to do is try to work within how European colonial modernity produces white supremacy. White supremacy as this kind of logic, practice, sometimes embodied, sometimes completely disembodied and abstracted, that actually can determine the boundaries between the human and the non-human on mass scales ever since the globe became the object of European intellectual and military control. And so the ontological eviction of blackness from humanity that Fanon takes on over and over and over again, and that is so core to black diaspora criticism and to an anti-racist engagement with knowledge itself, or the theory of being, I think has a lot of productive connectivities here to be drawn with a critique of white supremacist settler colonization as a project of ontological conquest, and how are many bodies and many forms of autonomous governance, African governance, indigenous governance in the Americas being undercut and destroyed through this imposition of a form of knowledge that's also a form of social control and forced transformation. So when indigenous academics are telling Professor Henry that they feel alienated from their jobs because it's impossible for them to bring their ceremony into their classrooms, or to be able to even think in a space that is literally spatially organized, just like this room. And I'm not saying you should like all move to another room, we could. But that, you know, I'm going to work in rectangular rooms for the rest of my career probably, unless we do that thing we were talking about before. But anyway, so there's, but you know, that, like this is the theory of being that I'm talking about, and this way that we're facing one another, and so that if I read it correctly or heard her speaking correctly, for an Indigenous faculty person to say, coming into this environment, it's actually impossible or almost impossible to think like myself here. How much violence is embedded in this academic project that we're trying to talk about. So it's fish and water, definitely, but it's also about what are we going, and then noticing what's going on. But this must be affecting more people than only Indigenous people. This must be affecting more people than just old racialized people. This must be actually shaping everyone's consciousness. And it must be part of how these consciousnesses that we exist in, that are sometimes in synergy and sometimes in struggle, are coming into existence. And so we need to think across those differences as well to sort it out. And I think I'm done. Oh, good. I have 2 minutes. I can do that. I can do that. Actually, I already mentioned off the cuff a few things that I found so inspirational from your work today. But yes, we are still in a colonial moment. I appreciated that, just to repeat it, again, if I got it right, to speak of both the way that that knowledge is presumptively and normatively Eurocentric, especially abstracted knowledge or knowledge that's not supposed to ever be situated or interrogated. But even knowledge that knows that it's from someplace is Eurocentric too, normatively here in this kind of thing that we're involved in. But then there's also this interesting form of appropriation that happens when potentially liberatory or radical or revolutionary languages ever enter into that space. And it's that moment of translation where I love that I had bell hooks in my second sentence, because it's that moment where you think, because I've thought about privileges and first world, third world privileges and the ways that different forms, people involved in women of color feminism talked about this quite a lot, that the US third world feminist project that Sheila Sandoval talked about actually ended up having a certain kind of global privilege in relationship to global women's movements, even though mostly it only talked about oppression for women in some space. So I get where we're going with this, and it's a very powerful critique. But I am going to finish. Thank you. Which is just that, yeah, okay, maybe there were 2 things, but I'll end on one. That there, to reiterate a comment that I made in a conversation after my talk, I feel like in various ways we are all agreeing, and maybe to different degrees or maybe in different contexts, and maybe there are differences there, but I won't know how to say what they are. But I could say that we're agreeing that there are moments when the project of inclusion is not the answer, either because it seems to be not enough, or because it seems to be precisely part of the whole problem in the first place. And I think that, as far as if you listen to the people who talk about indigenizing the academy, because there's a lot of literature, including a book by that title, Indigenous people are willing to practice the work of introducing Indigenous governance and ontologies into settler spaces by joining the academy. But that's not the end point of the work. It's the start of something. So I would say that inclusion can't be the end.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
So those of you who like the idea of questions from the universe will be pleased to know that 2 of them came in earlier that were general enough that we thought they might be better addressed to the panel as a whole. So we'll get them read now.
So we have a couple of questions coming from one of our online participants, Jackie, and she asks, first, is it important for people to embrace masculine and feminine characteristics? And secondly, would you recommend that people start to dismantle or reorganize social institutions inside and outside the academy to promote equality and justice? And if so, how would you recommend going about doing this?
Small questions.
That's a very small question.
Well, we already heard we should fire all the administrators.
Well, that's if I get to be queen for the day, I would just have them reapply. Okay. That's what I said. Well, I'll take a shot at it. I do think that the questions are difficult ones. The first one about it, important about masculine and feminine characteristics, without trying to be difficult, I need to know what a person means by masculine and feminine characteristics in the first place. You know, are we talking about biological determinism or not? And the reason I say that is an example that I used. My style of talking to and the directness. I remember much earlier in my career, someone saying to me that the manner and the metaphors that I use contain a tremendous amount of violence, and they're profoundly masculine in the way that I speak. And I looked at the person and I said, you are very confused, because I do not believe that the model that I am relying on has anything to do with masculinity, which I'm presuming you mean by white male masculinity. I actually think it is a black feminist model, because you seem to forget from the colonial moment we were willing to burn down people's houses around their heads to get free. So my view is that my historical being actually incorporates a moment where talking may not be enough and you require to do something direct and physical. So my incorporating metaphors that starkly point out the need for physical action is not an internalization of masculinity. I feel it is a full manifestation of my black femininity. So I say that because this disruption that we're talking about here, and that knowing across differences, requires us to then rethink all of those elements of what it is that is contained in the box that you're calling masculine and you're calling feminine. What is it that you are privileging or not, or frightened or not of in the respective boxes, and be prepared that not all persons, based on their gender, actually are operating with that. And you still get yet another order of magnitude about what that means, and it raises all kinds of critical issues when you're starting to get into issues of sexual identity. I mean, I've had that tension, for example, as a woman and as a black person with aspects of sexual identity politics which I'm extremely supportive of, but the whole issue of camp and the sort of the notion of a hyper-femininity as a part of an expression of somebody else's sexual identity has always been highly problematic for me, and in some ways is very akin to my sort of visceral response to blackface when white people portrayed black people in that way. There's some of these conversations about articulation, expression, notions of third sex, all of these different ideas that really require us to sort of interrogate masculinity, femininity, who gets to perform, what's performance, what's authenticity. So I probably made Jackie's life more hellish there.
What she said.
So there's a second question, I think, as well.
Yeah, sure, so I can reiterate. The second question is, would you recommend that people start to dismantle or reorganize social institutions inside and outside academia, and that this would be to promote equality and justice? If so, how would you recommend doing this?
So one thing that I've thought about a lot along these lines, we're thinking about sort of concrete changes, like bodies in departments in universities, that our disciplinary structure messes us up in all kinds of ways. And one of the things that's interesting is looking at the interactions among the different institutions that have been, they stop each other from being able to move. So for example, if we think about something concrete, like should we be able, like parental leave, for example. One of the barriers to some departments in the sciences supporting issues of parental leave has to do with the fact that granting agencies don't have a place for that. And what does one do with one's grants and one's labs if you have a break in your productivity? And sometimes granting agencies don't change because what's happening then is something that there's a set of norms and structures and practices that are inherent in our professional organizations. And so we have universities consisting of departments. You could imagine peas in a pod in a very simple way. Of course, women's studies doesn't fit in there because we're all everywhere. But so you can think of that sort of situation, which is then overlapping with the people who pay us in different kinds of ways, which is then also overlapping with oftentimes our collaborative relationships, our relationships with our professional organizations in different ways. And an effective change in one of those things often requires similar and concurrent change in other kinds of these issues, and so things just get intertwined and tangled up, and I think that's one of the things that makes change so difficult.
I guess I would add that I think about this in terms of when I'm thinking about my own experience of marginalization. I feel I am responsible to beware uploading some form of official recognition for that. I'm thinking of Sarah Ahmed here among other people, and as well as Jasbir Puar and the critique of homo-nationalism, to beware of uploading, for instance, my queerness into a state formation as if, you know, as if my pain will be resolved by getting a big institutional hug. Whereas actually instead, one could understand that challenging systematic and persistent and pervasive and unending oppression often, I would say actually often will involve engaging directly with institutions and attempting to get inside of them and transform them from within. But that's why I keep returning to this argument that to insist on a deep suspicion, especially when we are marginalized and are attempting to do this supposedly in our own benefit, to be aware that we are actually making ourselves newly complicit in forms of power we were probably already complicit in anyway, but now more so because we've actually associated our own liberation with the complicity. So at some level, there has to be awareness that that's creating change, and I guess it's social, but you know, it's not necessarily the entirety of the kind of institutional change, whether it's the academy or some other institution that we were looking for. And speaking of it in relationship to to inhabiting and inheriting forms of privilege and being suspicious of inclusion is something I've already talked about in my talk, so I won't speak about it more.
Was that it for the questions for the universe? Okay, so now, I don't know if you're not in the universe where you are, but questions in this room. Yes?
It's all right. I'll pick up the side. It's not your fault. Thank you everyone for your presentations earlier and also for these comments. I guess what I'm going to ask about, it's kind of a convoluted question, but at the same time it's not. It's more asking in a sense for advice or your perspective on things. And I related to a lot of what Joanna said in her talk. My PhD actually is in a field that allows me to be outside of academia very easily. So it was a choice that I made to come to an academic institution. I could have very easily gone to a United Nations organization. I could have gone to the World Bank. I know, don't throw things at me. I could is what I'm saying, okay? So, enough training in economics, all of that. I chose, and I wanted to be in academia, but I tried very hard to do, the bridging the gap between theory and practice, some of the things you talked about. And I used a few of the things that you talked about. So, for example, I always tell myself, I love my job. I take my work very seriously. I don't take myself seriously at all because I would go completely mad if I did, and I know that. So I use a lot of those. I always tell myself I can leave if I want to. That's always been one of the things I've always told myself in academia that really, if I'm not treated that well, if I don't like what I'm doing, you know what? I can earn a paycheck in lots of other places, and that's really helped me. It's really helped my career. But the other part of it is I feel as if, for the most part, in academic settings when I'm invited to speak, people tend to like me, just as a rule. Because more often than not, I'm, in a sense, at the risk of using a cliched expression, preaching to the choir. Because there are people who do believe in the things that I'm talking about, they agree with me, they generally tend to like me. Often, when I'm trying to also do the rest of the work, which you might appreciate as a lawyer, you're trying to do influence policy, for example, I get invited to a lot of forums that are very different. So say I'm invited to present something as part of a panel, well, June next year, I'm going to a UNESCO panel in Switzerland on technology and development and gender, Often that's thrown in at the last, and I know that it's very tokenistic. So I know that when the Asian Development Bank invites me for a forum and there are 30 papers, I'm the only one who's going to present any kind of gender perspective. And I know that I've been included precisely because of that, and I'm not, foolish about that. So when I go there, does it bother me that I'm often referred to as Miss Barua, even though I have a PhD, of course, and everybody else is being referred to as a doctor? All of that. But in a way, some of what you were saying is, I have to give them that power for me to be offended. I turn on the microphone and I say, actually, that's Dr. Burrow, I have a PhD. I do that all the time because it's really offensive when it happens. But beyond that, am I just torturing myself? Is it worth it? Like, I kind of often wonder that. I could very easily just go to conferences where I'm not put through that kind of agony. Do you know what I mean? I could go to conferences where people generally like me, things are well received, or go to places where I know there's going to be incredible hostility. But at the same time, if I don't, there may not be that perspective at all in that forum. And I was just kind of wondering how you navigate that when you say that we have to make ourselves the whole discomfort factor. I feel that there's a lot of discomfort in what I do in some of these settings. And I kind of wonder if it's worth it.
Well, what I think is the starting point is actually the self. I do believe at the end of the day, what you seek in life is not only moments of intellectual engagement, but moments of satisfaction and joy. And that the moments of joy are not supposed to be fleeting. So there has to be a congruence, a much higher congruence between your ability to navigate those settings and how you feel in those settings. You can't live a life by committee and say, because I'm one of the few, I apparently have this obligation to do it. I have no hesitation if I'm in a relatively low emotional ebb in terms of capacity to simply say flat out, no, I'm not going to place X because guess what? It's going to be a trummeling for me. Not regardless of what they're going to do or not, it's actually going to deplete my life force to do that. I have made a conscious decision in my entire career to choose to stay in majority spaces because I believe that is my personal gift. It is not my personal duty, it happens to be my gift. I see it that way. I don't see it as a sufferance. And it creates very strange opportunities. So I know exactly what you mean. I remember the counterterrorism work that I do came about in the most bizarre way. I was invited, all of you must know the RAND Corporation, that conservative think tank. So imagine me getting an email from the RAND Corporation asking me to speak at a conference. I actually thought, obviously, they're terribly confused. So I emailed back. Being the person I am, I emailed back and said, you're terribly confused. Like, let me tell you who I am, because you can't possibly want me for this conference. They write back and say, no, we want you. I'm sure, I don't know what's wrong with this person. Let me be clearer. And I say, I don't actually work in counterterrorism in the way that you might anticipate. Here's a list of my colleagues working in that area. You know, I really think you should select one of them because I'm trying to picture what would happen to the RAND Corporation should I arrive. And I end up with them writing back saying yes. I write back and say, let me be clear. I go, I would like to speak. Now, this is 9/11, post 9/11. I am writing to you to speak about strategies for sustaining multiculturalism in the face of the war on terror. That's what I write back. They write back, we are looking forward to your edgy presentation. I say to my mother, obviously I meant to go to LA. So I'm going to LA, I'm getting my girl clothes in my bag, and I am going. I go to this conference, and yes, I was an unusual creature in the midst of this conference. But you know what? I decided, obviously once I speak, they never invited me back, so that gave me tremendous freedom. I said exactly what I wanted to say. At the end of the day, I happened to be wrong. I turned out to be wrong because my style of speaking so directly in certain ways, but at the same time, I hope it comes across, I'm not terribly ideological. I don't tend to say a lot of things like, you're racist, I just talk about content all the time and what I think becomes competence. And it actually resonated for them at the point they were creating a counterterrorism program. So I do the work I do because I happen to think that what I do is place myself in spaces to have an opportunity to leverage my ideas in a space where they would otherwise not be able to hear those ideas. But I feel fully free to reject at each and any point, any invitation or any context, if it doesn't meet all of my criteria, my personal criteria. My personal criteria require me not to be suffering when I'm doing it. It sounds ridiculous, but it's that basic. It requires me not to feel that the experience is a painful one, you know? And so I would say, temper and measure how many of those things you do. but also see them for what they are, which is limited spaces, but also sometimes, I can't tell you what the best part is, sometimes this unexpected idea that has nothing to do with my field, that I suddenly realize I'm going to take this thing and make it something new. And if I wasn't in that space, I wouldn't have seen that very unusual thing from this very different place. And so that becomes I guess the intellectual part of me seeks out those moments of, I guess, unexpected beauty in an intellectual sense. But I do agree with you that those spaces are challenging, but I don't expect them to be spaces of community.
I'm evolving my own sort of code about when to say yes and when to say no, and that's going to be obviously very specific for me.
Yeah.
I've spoken at a RAND conference as well. But
yeah, and you know what it's like,
yeah.
and it was interesting and stimulating, but part of me is still, wow, I did that, diary.
So this is actually, just to jump in for a second, something, for a while I was spending almost all of my speaking engagements where people would have departments where there was trouble, and so you know, like, can you come give a talk and then assess our department and tell us what to do? And sometimes having that set of skills meant that I felt like that's something that I then had to say yes to. And so people were asking for the same talk over and over again, like, no, I wrote that 4 years ago now. I have had thoughts since then. And so one of the things, and that was exhausting, and so now my rule is once a semester only. But also one of the things that two girlfriends and I did was put together a program where we trained a bunch of other people to do this stuff. So through the Committee on the Status of Women for the American Philosophical Association, we started the site visit program, where now we send teams of 3 people to go and look into universities. And part of the way, and so part of it is, what makes me feel much more comfortable saying no, is enabling other people to say yes. And one of the things that was delightful is the number of people who are willing to step up and volunteer a huge amount of their time in order to work on making the academy, in this case philosophy, better than that.
Are there further questions? Yes, Melissa.
So there have been lots of nuggets of advice throughout the whole day, but I think I'd like to ask the question sort of again in a different way, since I think a lot of the audience here is graduate students of some sort, either in feminist studies, philosophy, education, what have you. So my question is, particularly because Scott brought up the fact that you're all coming at this from different perspectives, facing challenges in different ways. What advice might you give to those grad students who identify as some type of underrepresented group in terms of either in their research or in their own sort of survival or what have you, or personal experiences in the academy for navigating our power, or in some cases powerless, relationship as grad students and the issues we've been talking about with the challenges in the academy?
So one of my experiences in graduate school was oftentimes being the only woman in the class, or the only woman in the room, or if you do philosophy of sciences.
The only woman in the program.
Yeah, and it happens at conferences, it happens, you know, you go to the major philosophy of science conferences, and the more rigorous they get, the more they are all boys. And so for me, one of the things that was important was actually, it was almost like it was 1970 again, but the notion of a woman's only space to do research. The first time I experienced that was the first time I felt like a grown-up professor. And by that time I was almost ready to go for tenure, right? And so that notion of having support in that way is very, very important. And creating those kinds of networks is very important.
Anything to add?
I might just add that I think we go to graduate school sometimes to learn about things that are outside of ourselves, but the reason why, if that's what we're doing, the reason why we do that is often because we are also sorting out who we are in relationship to that thing. And sometimes we go to graduate school precisely to look at who we are, which is another way of doing it. I'm not saying there's only 2 options. But there's a constantly transforming sense of self there, and so I would encourage people to to take that seriously. It's not something, it exceeds the academy, and it was happening before you came, it'll be happening after you leave. It'll happen regardless of whether you are taking up a career in this kind of institution or not. You know, why are you here? What really motivates you? These are really basic questions, but you ask for advice, and I'm like, you know what, let's just break it down. And so I'm like, is there a good reason for you to be here? Sometimes there really is, that's why you came. But sometimes we should ask that question. It's like, maybe I need to take a break. Or maybe I need to finish what I'm doing and then rethink what I do next. And yeah, just staying open to learning, because we also learn about the self by watching the self transform.
My advice is a little bit different, perhaps thinking, and I think complements what both of my colleagues have said, but it's coming specifically from a type of vulnerability I think you face, not simply if you're racialized, but I think if you're uniquely entering with a perspective that is oppositional to the entity in which you're in. In many ways, I think it is too late to begin that navigation process once you're inside the institution with the wrong supervisor. I think that people fail to do enough work before they choose. So in other words, you've already made a determination, you would like to do something interesting and radical. I cannot tell you the points at which I've spoken to people, and I do speak to people outside of my discipline who suddenly find themselves in this horrible situation where they've selected, for example, a scholar. Perhaps it's a feminist scholar whose work they admire, or whatever, a person who does class analysis that they think is wonderful. And they think that is complementary to my agenda. They actually suddenly learn more about that scholar than they ever wished to know, because their entire academic freedom is completely oppressed to produce the work they want. And at that point, they are in a living hell on earth to try to figure out what to do. And if that scholar is not personally responsible and decides to be somewhat oppressive and abusive, it gets really ugly. And I find that often when I'm called in to provide support at that time, there's a limited amount of levers available to me. I tend to say to people before, even if it's law, I tend to say, you know, it's my field, and I'll say, you know what, you think you love that person's work. That's all well and good. You have zero idea of what they're like as a supervisor. Put in the extra work to figure out if anybody else from your community has ever worked with them. Figure out if they had a good or bad experience. Pick up the phone and try to find one or more of us that work with them that are similarly located in identity politics to you, to find out if we might be willing to risk the issues of a sort of fallback from that, to tell you frankly whether we have a concern or could make a better suggestion as to who could do it. The other piece is to strategize before you're in the program to compensate for that gap if you identify. You don't have to say to the person, oh, by the way, Professor St. Louis, I would like to work with you on critical race theory, but I'm really concerned about what you know about the Jewish community. No, propose to me, Professor St. Louis, how do you feel about some kind of collaborative supervision, that you are my principal supervisor, but I have in mind Professor XYZ, would you be comfortable with working with them or someone similarly located? If I tell you a flat out no, that's a big message to you. If I say to you, I'm more than willing to do that, and I'll be honest with you, in many instances in my institution, I found myself where I'm bringing that critical race perspective because my colleague says, I'm able to do XYZ, and they will actually say, I really need you to talk to Professor St. Louis and see whether she's willing to either review these sections of your work or to do whatever. That tells you something about the scholar, but you should be doing that ahead of time, because if they say no to you, what's your backup at that point? Especially if you're in a doctorate, what's your backup? The next and final piece I would say is be prepared for manifestations of sort of discrimination, but I again speak from the perspective of some of the racialized students who've spoken to me, that you don't expect, that the person may have written tremendously around race, but they actually are uncomfortable with your own radical perspective because you may be about to eclipse your supervisor. And so you have two problems: the possibility of the appropriation of your work in whole or in part by your supervisor who publishes one or more pieces of your work, or the rejection as not rigorous of one or more parts of your work when that is actually not the case, because it simply delays your ability to get the degree. And I'm saying I have seen both of those things happen. One of the ways to do that is you bring transparency to the individual and then you apologize afterwards. You ask for permission, you risk a no. What I suggest is you pick a scholar and you send an email and say, "Dear Professor so-and-so far off in some other department, I mean literally another university, I'm writing on XYZ, and I'd really be interested if you have an opportunity to comment on, if you could find an opportunity to comment on XYZ, it builds on your theory." So if you write to me, "Dear Professor St. Louis, guess what? If you've made it transparent to your supervisor, you have now marked in time the point at which you own those ideas. I am now absolutely your check and your witness, whether or not I've provided you a single word back." It also sets up the possibility that you need someone like me at some point on your thesis committee. So I'm saying you need probably, if you are oppositional in your theoretical approach to the department or unit you're in, you will need support that is other than peer support outside the unit in which you're seeking to do your work, particularly at the doctoral level. And you should anticipate that and try to think it through, because the real problem, I would argue, is not actually simply the behavior of supervisors who behave inappropriately. I think what I find the most troubling is the pain of the betrayal and the impact and the length of time for the recovery from the individual who feels betrayed in that setting, because their expectation and their experience has such a great gap. So that would be I tend to be a rubber hits the road pragmatic type of person, so that would be my advice.
I don't know. Can I have one quick thing?
Quick.
Okay, so
Food has arrived.
that'll be really quick. So one quick thing I'd like to add is, for me, the biggest benefit of this job is we get to study what we want to study. And so many times, I think especially people who end up or in marginal positions or want to study things that are radical in different kinds of ways get shut down. And it's true, as scholars, we need to advance scholarship in a particular field. But my thinking about this is that if we try to bend what we're interested in to fit what we think will be popular, what you've done at that point is giving away the best part of this job. In which case, I mean, why not get a job that pays more? Yeah.
On that happy note, 2 rounds of applause, please. And finally, for our fearless organizer, Helen Fielding.
Thank you for that. I also have many people to thank. Our speakers who were absolutely amazing, invisible prizes for being so amazing. This has been quite a day for us. I think we've all have so much to think about and so much to digest, and we've really learned a lot. So thank you so much for that. I also want to thank all of the people who contributed to making this day. You know, half of you have been volunteering today with the graduate students and undergraduate students, making sure that the food was out and taking it away, and everything went, and registration, everything just went so smoothly. It's amazing. And of course to Catherine Okamuk and Bonnie McLaughlin and Jessica Polzer and Patrick Barua, who are also part of the team, the organizational team, and Jacob Eoy, who organized the student volunteers, and to Reuven Brandt and to Martin Vezer, who've done this amazing job with technology. These are PhD students in philosophy who just took this on. So thank you so much. And of course to the Royal Society of Canada and the President's Office for providing the funds and the support that we can now move to a glass of wine and for the whole day, for the whole thing possible. So thank you.